So Denice, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thanks, Jeremy.
Of course. So, before you became, chief data scientist of the US, I know you were living in New Orleans before Katrina and during the hurricane. And we're working on some really fascinating and meaningful data projects there. Can you talk a bit about what the role, your role was at the time, and then sort of how you saw the impact of some of those data needs, both during and after Hurricane Katrina?
Absolutely. Well, so I should mention I started my career as a web designer in the late 90s and got good at making large, easy to use websites and was recruited to New Orleans around 2000 because there was this opportunity with the decennial census being published, the 2000 census. It was the first time that those data were being released and the internet existed. So there was this possibility that we could democratize that data so that instead of decisions being made behind closed doors by people in power with resources and statisticians to make decisions about communities could use those data to advocate on behalf of their own destinies. And so we spent about 4 years from 2001 when the data were released to the storm in 2005, really just building local capacity to use data, starting with where people were, and that was in writing grant proposals, right? If you look at the overall numbers for New Orleans, it looks like a pretty typical city. But when you start to disaggregate by geographic area and by demographics, that's when these incredible disparities
Right.
reveal themselves, right? And of course, then Katrina, laid that bare to the rest of the
Exacerbated
world.
that, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So making these data really easy for nonprofits and community-based organizations and even City Hall to access. The idea was that it would allow more external funding to come into the city from philanthropy and federal grants and whatnot, because it would be easier to make the case for need. So that's where we started, and we spent about 4 years, begging people to use data. It's hard in a city that has such a robust history like that, where decisions are made based on how things have always been done, based on who you know, right? Not necessarily data. But when Hurricane Katrina happened, and I always like to just mention that we actually got the good side of the storm. It wobbled to the east at the last minute. It was only a Category 3. It was a failure of
Yeah.
the federal infrastructure that flooded 80% of the city. And when that happened, all of those data became instantly historical. And the old way of making decisions didn't work anymore because our lives were turned upside down. And people were really flying blind during a period in the city where we needed good intel. In order to make so many decisions, there were decisions were coming at us. So I worked for this local data intermediary, and we were a nonprofit. And right after the storm, we started to get questions about like what's the population in this neighborhood? Where should we put the health clinics? Like
Yeah.
where should we stand up these temporary clinics? The city hall wanted to know which parks should they rehab first and get rid of the toxic sludge that had landed in those parks. Like where are the kids going to be repopulating first? Businesses needed to know, like, what corner stores are the ones that we should really prioritize. And there were no answers to those really basic questions. And so we started to get creative. It was like certainly we'd been dependent on federal data, and that was actually well, I should mention before I even went home after evacuating, I evacuated to Phoenix and stayed with my folks for a while. Before I even went home, I flew to DC and went to the Urban Institute to one of the meetings of the National Neighborhood Indicator Partners, and got introduced to some folks at the Census Bureau. And so, we naively went up to the Census Bureau and asked them if they could just like do a special count for New Orleans, and they explained it doesn't work that way. And so, at that point, I realized that I had been taking these
What?
federal
Sorry.
data.
What?
Uh-huh.
What way does it work though? Like they're saying, what would the
Yeah, so
response like? We don't do that type
they
of thing
don't do
even in
special
emergencies.
censuses.
Yeah.
No, no. They so there is one small program that can where a city can pay to have a special census done.
Yeah.
But it's very onerous and very expensive and usually
Right.
doesn't pay off. And it turned out actually that the repopulation was happening so quickly that by the time we got the numbers would have dramatically changed.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. What they did do, which was nice, is they provided technical assistance to the local public health institute to walk the streets in the months following the storm, and they did a daytime and a nighttime survey of occupied houses
Mm,
so that we could see and what you could see both from the traffic data and also from the survey data is that people were commuting in to work on their broken houses during the day and then commuting out to sleep.
wow.
Yeah. But what was interesting at that point, and this was really formative for me as an open data advocate later, those survey data about the daytime and nighttime populations were not made public. And so it was a PDF that was emailed just to a small list of people inside City Hall and at the Public Health Institute. That and so I would occasionally get sort of a black market version of the PDF. And but we really the challenge was, right, the entire community needed that data, and there was no reason to keep it secret. Back in 2005, open data wasn't really in the national consciousness yet. It wasn't until President Obama's Open Government Directive. So what we ended up doing to answer all of those questions that were coming in, once we realized that the federal statistics just weren't they weren't designed for these types of rapidly changing situations. We looked at all these different proxy data. We looked at nighttime lights as a proxy for, places that were occupied. We looked at traffic patterns. We looked at utility hookups. And it turned out that the best proxy for repopulation was from the company that sends you junk mail, the Missing Children's postcard.
Yeah.
They purchase data from the U.S. Postal Service, and then they add, they sort of improve the quality of it, and they have a business case for making sure that junk mail is not going to empty houses, and they update that data monthly. And they donated their data to our nonprofit with under the condition that we would not release the address level data. So we aggregated it by block, and then every month we could show percent repopulation block by block. And that was like turning on a light in a dark room. It helped nonprofits, for example, identify blocks that were on a tipping point, and that if they put a little bit of case management toward helping people get back into the remaining
Right.
homes there, then you would have a complete street, and then you could move on to the next block. The idea there was to avoid the jack-o'-lantern effect, where we might have houses repopulating all over the place, but not enough infrastructure to support everyone.
So data ended up being an incredibly powerful tool for, reviving New Orleans after this, incredible catastrophe. And we will come back to the role of, private sector data in informing a lot of these, public policy and kind of disaster decisions. But I think the way that you and I met was through the, dearly departed data sets, which has a Halloween type theme to it. There it feels like there's these, kind of haunted ghouls that are, traveling around these data sets. But we are now living in an era where the current administration and several, agencies are canceling data sets, removing reports from websites, bringing down a lot of the different types of ways that they measure different demographics. There was this huge, kind of range of ways to measure it. Almost exactly a year ago, the New York Times published a piece saying that 8,000 government websites went dark, on
Right.
I think it was week in January at 5 p.m. on a
Yep.
Friday. And you have done an incredible amount of work figuring out what has actually disappeared, what has changed, what is not quite real. So, can you talk a little bit about your efforts with the dearly departed data sets, what we know about the loss of data that is occurring now? And then we'll talk a bit about like what the impact has been for communities.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. The reason we went with the theme of dearly departed data sets was two. One was Halloween was approaching, so we thought it was a good fit. But secondly, if you're a data user, these data sets, they're like old friends, right? We give them nicknames like Nibers and Humda and Nape, and we get to know them very well, and we know their strengths, and we sort of curse at their weaknesses often. But we definitely mourn their losses when they become weakened, or when they don't show up on time, or when they disappear altogether. And what we had seen is that at the end of January, there was a big takedown of data in order to comply with the executive orders, mostly on DEI, gender, and climate. And so a
Right.
bunch of data sets were pulled down. Some of them were scrubbed, and then put back up. Most of the data ended up coming back. There were some data elements that were like surgically removed in a very sloppy methodological way, and that was well documented in a Lancet article a few months ago, where, for example, if the survey collected data about gender, the column header was changed to say sex, but the documentation didn't mention that that change had been made. So
Mm.
there was some sloppiness there to
Right.
comply. Um, but that wasn't really where the biggest risk to data overall is. There's sort of two other buckets of damage that we've seen since January of 2025. The second bucket is just what I refer to as a death by a thousand cuts, and that's due to the loss of staffing, the loss of contracts that are necessary to collect, clean, and protect data collections. The terminations of the scientific advisory committees, which are really critical, especially to keep collections on top of changes in society, and
Yeah.
sort of updating as things change. And then there's also just like it's just harder to get things done in federal government under this administration, because there's so much additional bottlenecking with the requirement for political approval. For example, in commerce, any contract over a certain amount has to be personally signed by the secretary. And so it's just harder to do the business of government, and there are fewer people to do it. And the tricky thing about that death by a thousand cuts is that there's a great deal of ambiguity about when a data set is at risk or is gone.
Right. Yeah, and I think that second part is one that is much harder to view, that I think fewer people realize is going up, like the gumming of the works that
Hmm.
happens, in this universe of, statistical analysis and data gathering that can truly, you know, slow and debilitate our process to gather this. Like,
Right.
you don't get that type of flashy headline of like all these data sets are removed, or you don't have that ability to monitor it, in README reports and those types of things. Like that
Yeah.
slowness that comes on is debilitating, and is often really hard to, walk back from.
Yeah,
On the
it's really scary. It's going to be very hard to recover from the death by a thousand cuts. And we won't even know the ways that that we won't know which data sets are suffering, and in the different ways that they are. One thing that I think about a lot is the ground-based radar that's used to warn communities about tornadoes that are coming their way. If you think about it, there's locations where there's hardware. Some of those radar locations are staffed by career civil servants. Some are staffed by contractors. Are those contracts still going? Are those staff still in place? Like, will those ground-based radar stations just start to sort of disintegrate? And will that impact the ability for communities to get timely notice when a tornado is coming their way?
Yeah, I think that's such a clear and powerful example, right, of how the, kind of loss of some of this data and the funding can have real impact on communities, right? Not knowing that a tornado is coming your way, or, in the way of your, parents and a few towns over, can be really devastating.
Yep.
Um, a few data sets, though, that you had, and your team had kind of identified, right? So there's the USDA survey on food security, DOJ record on police misconduct, Department of Education survey on post-pandemic recovery. There's the NOAA, billion-dollar data set that's been disappearing, EPA maps on environmental justice. Like, for you, looking across several of these, having these,
Hmm.
data sets as your, children and friends, kind of like through your life, are there ones that, really stick out to you as being quite, pernicious for the loss, and in particular about like, rising inequality from some of these, or ones where you see that, this actually maybe made sense in some of the, data work that you have been doing for a while?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The certainly one data set that hurt was the food security supplement that USDA runs in collaboration with the Census Bureau. That when I so I talked about the two buckets of damage. One was the in order to sort of align with administration priorities, and then there's this death by 1,000 cuts. There's a third category of damages to data sets that we're doing, and those are data that are that that might reveal that administration policies aren't working very
Mm,
well for all Americans. And the food security supplement, I think, falls into that category because it was canceled just as millions of Americans were about ready to lose access to their food stamp eligibility. And that data set had been around for 30 years. It was
from the
the only
big
way.
beautiful bill, you mean?
Yeah, 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 it was the only way that we know whether children and adults, across each state in America have enough healthy food on the table. So it gives the state level perspective, it's disaggregated by age. And what worries me about that data loss is it sets the precedent for canceling data sets that might reflect poorly on other administration policies.
Yeah, and I know, right before this, you and I were chatting about just this morning, Molly Smith at Bloomberg had kind of published this piece talking about that, final category, not only in addition to the loss of some of these data sets and what it means, for the gumming
Right,
up of the system and the death by 1,000 cuts, but when we don't have the ability to, monitor how effective or ineffective some policies are, we limit our ability to, vote politicians in and out,
right.
decide what policies are working, right? If we don't know that this made a dent in poverty, we might not be willing to, fund it year after year. Um, One argument that I have heard on the other side, maybe two arguments that I've heard on the other side are around, you know, like surveys and the cost of some of these rights, that we are spending all of this money asking all these questions of so many Americans, and we're kind of repeating ourselves across many of these things, and this may be not so important, right? So like, could we be gathering this, data from other sources? And I think the second part, in relation to this, which is around like transparency. And I think I heard from several people during the government shutdown that we had a real loss of reporting of data, right? We didn't have like employment numbers come out, we didn't have inflation numbers come out, and the world kind of ticked on the way that it had before. Like we found that from other sources, like it maybe came back eventually. We looked for other signals.
Right.
And I think even in your Katrina example, you talked about these other ways that we can sometimes find data. So can you talk about like what it means, like what you think about these arguments of like cost cutting from surveys, as well as like the value of transparency for some of these reports?
Yeah, well, I'll start with the second issue. Certainly during the shutdown, the private sector stepped in because they needed some numbers to go by. The that All of them, though, all of the private sector entities that were publishing numbers said that it was a stopgap measure, and that they, really depend on those official statistics coming out of the
Yeah.
federal government. And that's the case, even if you see, for example, one of my favorite sort of data resilience stories is with the crime data. So FBI, historically, they publish annual crime data at the end of the year. It takes them 9 months to collect and process all of the data from the nation's 18,000 law enforcement agencies. And they have this, very robust quality checking process, and then they release the final numbers. That's too long for a lot of use cases. And Jeff Asher and his real time crime index, 2 Septembers ago, he launched it, and it hoovers up as many data sets as it can get, every month, and publishes monthly estimates of crime, which are good enough to inform the national dialogue. But
Right.
his work is a really nice complement to the official statistics, but in no way is it a replacement for them. We need both. because there's always that tension between timeliness and quality. And both of them, it just depends on where you're going to spend your money, on the timeliness or the quality, but you can't have both. And so, as I think about the future of data, thinking about like how might we build in some resilience so that we have both the official statistics and then a bunch of complementary data to help us better understand what's happening. Um, but I think if anything, the shutdown showed us that people really care about the official statistics.
Yeah. Um, One thing I'll mention too before talking about like the survey cost cutting part
Yeah,
is I do a lot of this work on U.S. inequality and mapping across all these different areas. And like as I kind of talk in other schools and spaces about this work, I often get a lot of questions, often from international students, like, is this work possible to do in my country? Like, have you seen this work effectively in India and China and Canada and France? And I think one thing that sometimes helps the U.S. stand out in relation to some of these other countries is that we have a you know, federal government and many of these agencies where we very much so trust the data that comes out of it, right? You often hear these, kind of claims in particular for, China that like, do we always trust the numbers that,
right.
are coming out of that, administration there? And we live in a fortunate society for so long where we have been able to, build businesses and forecast investments and spend all this time based off of the numbers that, Department of Labor Statistics and bureaus and census are sharing on these things. And when you start to degrade that, you degrade our
Right.
trust and our ability to like make investments and decisions based off of that.
I agree, and I think the my favorite attribute of U.S. data is our commitment to disaggregation and getting more detail. Whether you're disaggregating by geographic area, so we can understand disparities between urban and rural, whether you're breaking things down in terms of veteran status and military connectedness, sexual orientation, gender identity, race, ethnicity, income level. You have to slice and dice the data to understand how policies are affecting different segments of the American population. And that was when I was the chief data scientist of the United States under the Biden administration. One thing I really loved about that job is I felt like I had just one job with that role, and that was to build the capacity of federal agencies to disaggregate data so that we could identify disparities and then use the levers of government to fix them. So, just turn on the light. Let's eyes wide open. Like, let's see how these policies are
It's
not meeting
powerful.
the needs of Americans. And my favorite moment doing that type of work was with the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was just a generational investment in American communities. And the president had been clear that he wanted to make sure we were not leaving behind any communities in America. And so my team was in charge of making the map with the dots on it that the president would stand in front of. And so that was the
That's an
PR side
important
of it,
map.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, the map with the dots. We've all
Yeah.
made the maps with the dots before. Um, and then behind the scenes, we did the inverse. Well, what counties don't have dots? And those dots, it will not surprise you, those dots were not evenly distributed across the United States. They were in Appalachia, they were in the southern Black Belt, they were along the border of Mexico, in tribal nations. The same patterns that we see over and over again in America showed up geographically. And
Right.
when the agency leadership saw this pattern manifest, it really and they were on fire to make sure that we the way we implemented the rollout of the infrastructure law did not leave behind any communities. So maybe that might manifest in a second issuance of a notice of funding opportunity and technical assistance to those counties that had not applied the first time around, or maybe changing the requirements so that we it was easier for lower capacity communities to apply. And so that was something that across federal agencies, we had data analysts who were using this approach of disaggregating the data, looking for disparities, and then informing the policy in real time so we could make mid-course corrections.
Yeah, and I think what's kind of subtle point that's quite important in what you're saying is like this disaggregation not only by, geographic view, right, in terms of states or counties, or zip codes, but also across demographics, right, that we are actually,
Hmm.
reflecting the different communities that want to be represented, and have been seeing these, kind of fascinating stats that I think it's a category of like no such race or something in the census that has, grown 129% over the last
Some
10
other
years.
race. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that, people no longer necessarily like see themselves kind of like reflected in some of these categories, and what we can do to make sure that we are, supporting kind of some of these, various, demographics and communities, that they are getting, the investments that they need based off of, historical wrongs or where, the US is currently headed. One thing though that I'm curious why you think this exists kind of in this like universe of disaggregation is right in this, Bloomberg article from this morning talking about sort of the loss of data that we have seen over the last year. I think it's the CDC infant, and maternal mortality data is no longer being aggregated up to the national level. It
Yeah.
only it only seems to exist at the state level, basically
Yeah.
requiring, doctors and statisticians to like go through various state reports to then like, pull out their iPhone calculators and like add those up to get the national number. Is that meant to obfuscate the reality? Like in some ways that feel, you are disaggregating, like you're kind of like pushing things out to the
Right.
states, but are you trying to mask the national picture because you're worried about what it says on this front?
I've wondered about that. That's the PRAMS data, the Pregnancy Risk Assessment Monitoring System, and they did fire all 17 staff in that office. So this could be just sort of collateral damage. It could also be that some of the policies around Medicaid and food assistance and whatnot, that
Mm.
there's concern that that might have some downstream consequences for maternal and infant health. I don't know what the intent is, but certainly, what has happened is they've introduced a lot more friction. They've shifted burden to the states, to because the CDC doesn't have staff to provide technical assistance for the collection, and now the state data people have to answer requests from researchers rather than that being centralized. And the CDC staff was actually doing a lot of work to
That's
sort of
interesting.
clean and normalize the data. So there was a tremendous value add when Congress, sort of required the creation of the PRAMS data set. There is, like I could imagine that we could set up sort of a heart lung machine, bypass machine for that collection for the next few years in civil society. But it really seems like that's a function that belongs inside of the federal government. Because it's such a critical collection and the scale is so vast. And in order to be meaningful, it has to really collect data about all demographics across America.
I don't know if it's just because I recently rewatched the first Spider-Man that I have this visual in my mind, but there's that moment, where he's like, kind of shooting the webs out, trying to hold back this like train behind him. And I think that visual and that type of thing is what's really very much so like falling on states, on civil
Yeah.
society, on like, nonprofits, on like good data people who just love to like stand up these GitHub repos. Like they are pulling together all of these threads themselves and like having to bear a lot of this responsibility, often with not enough funding, not enough
Yep.
support staff, to do that work. Um, and that is obviously really challenging and kind of like, dangerous for a lot of this work because you can't rely on like just good data citizens to make this their full-time job
Right.
to, kind of collect and do those, heart lung machines to keep those on for a while.
Yeah.
So in this vein of, and going back to this like this cost cutting narrative, right? You spent time actually working with, folks who were generating these, surveys. You spent a lot of time working on this. Like, is this a total phony narrative about cost cutting for surveys and reducing some of this? Or is there
Yeah.
actual like government efficiency cost saving that we can have about not asking for address and social security number like 15 times across
Right.
these different, resources?
I have so much humility about this because you just never know how a data set is being used. and it's easy to sort of like, so I remember, for example, someone complaining about how we have two numbers for the number of veterans in America. We have the American Community Survey number, and then we have the numbers that are produced by the Veterans Administration.
Yeah.
And why can't we just have a single number? I was like, well, it depends on the fitness for use. Like if you're collecting the numbers to serve actual people, you need the administrative data and the numbers of people who are enrolled in VA services. If you're trying to understand how you can better meet the needs of Americans, then the American Community Survey, sample survey is the way to go. And so it really does depend on the purpose, the fitness for purpose for different collections. And certainly you did sort of address some of the challenges with collecting, how we collect the same information across collections from people and third parties. And I think there is an opportunity to have more robust but very responsible data sharing across components within agencies and even across agencies to reduce administrative burden. That's like what the Paperwork Reduction Act is supposed to do, and that's supposed to be the role of OIRA and OMB. We really have fallen short on that, and there's and then there's good reason to try to streamline it. However, it's hard to do that in an environment where data that are collected for one purpose are being weaponized against
Mm.
populations. For example, data collected to help someone with a Medicaid or SNAP application being used for immigration enforcement. And that can have a real chilling effect on the entire ecosystem. And I suspect, we're hearing anecdotally, right, that it's impacting people's willingness to seek out services that they need. And I suspect we'll also see that it results in, an even more precipitously declining response rate for surveys. That distrust of how the data is going to be used.
Yeah, in so much of this, like census response rate, work that I've, done, you often tend to see in some of these
Right.
like high immigrant communities, Native American communities that have had that high distrust, you tend to see much lower response rates there, which create this, downward cycle where you get less investment because
Right.
people think there are fewer people there or that the need isn't as great as it actually is. But in this part about sharing across agencies, right? Like you like to think about it as this kumbaya moment where we all join hands and share everything in
Right.
this big pool. But right, I think right now in this upcoming tax season, my estimate is that we are going to see decreased rates of like the earned income tax credit and child tax credit because people are worried that the
Yep.
IRS is sharing data with ICE. And so government efficiency, exactly as you say, can be, kind of weaponized in some of these other areas. And so some of those, breaks across agencies are actually done by design. And so limiting our ability to share data can be beneficial for some
Right.
folks when you have actually thought through some of those second, third, fourth order effects.
Yeah. It's really complicated. But as we think about the future of our national data infrastructure, we'll have to consider the balance, the trade-off between privacy and data sharing and utility.
So I know you are now at the Federation of American Scientists. You are doing work with Brookings and the Beck Center. Can you talk about like some of the various initiatives that you have been working on as kind of in your role as like the Spider Man holding together so many of these
Yeah,
threads.
well, I'll just quickly mention. Just a few weeks after the election, a group of I guess, deep data feds and I met in my dining room, and we mapped out all the things that we learned from the first Trump administration in terms of risks to data and what we thought might happen this time around. And two big themes arose. One was that we have never done a good enough job telling the story about why federal data matter to everyday Americans. And so that for me was like big unfinished business. And that's
Yeah.
why I stood up the website called essentialdata.us as a fellow at Federation of American Scientists. We've got almost 100 use cases now. And they center not the people who use the data, but the people who benefit from the data. Which is a big mindset shift because we're really used to centering the users. And then the second thing that we realized is that with, hundreds of thousands of federal data sets, that these changes were going to be coming fast and furious. And there are still policy windows where public input can have an outsized protective effect on data. And so what we've been doing at dataindex.us, we've got a newsletter, and we scour, the obscure websites across about data across the federal space, and then push out notifications when there are opportunities for public input. In fact, just yesterday we hosted a webinar, a 30-minute rapid response webinar on that pregnancy risk assessment monitoring system.
Mm.
And it had hundreds of people who attended to just learn about risks to one data set and how they can tell, how they can convey to federal data stewards how important this is for the work that they do.
Was
So I
there
encourage
anything
you.
you had heard at
Uh,
that? I said, was there anything you heard at that like stuck out to you in particular, or?
um, the Q&A was like was so robust, and it was clear to me that we have a community of data users, the people who use the params data, who have very successfully jumped over to being data advocates. And I think that's what we all need to do. Like, if you're using data and you're taking it for granted, like I used to do back before Katrina, now is the time. Like, it's not necessarily an anti-administration act to say, like, these data are important because this is how I use these data to, serve the American people. And so anyone who's using data also needs to be a data advocate at this point. And certainly there's a lot of opportunity for the federal government to provide better feedback loops. The Evidence Act of 2019 that President Trump signed has, encoded that federal data stewards need to engage the public to understand about the value of the data and how it can be improved. So this is just really in the spirit of that. There's no reason for federal agencies to do this alone. They need input from folks like us on the outside.
Yeah, one other thing that I've kind of found in this work of trying to be more of a data advocate in this is that so many conversations around many of these sensitive issues around food insecurity, or maternal mortality or infant mortality or climate change, it's difficult to broach those with some people, but data like allows you that entry point in many cases for people to begin that debate on those things, right? So you don't always
Right,
need to be like a data journalist or a data scientist or someone who makes maps or charts to do this, but like having those tools in your arsenal about what the numbers are, what the trends are saying, like what those
right,
types of things, it makes our ability to like have a national dialogue on these issues much more possible, and gives us like that starting point where we can disagree very much so on like what that means for our community, or how well we think that data was gathered. But without that starting point, I think it limits our ability to like do one of the things that our nation can and perhaps used to do better, like has have
right.
debates about these types of things.
Yeah, we also take for granted, some data are just necessary for like running a modern society. A few years ago, I got an email. I'd ordered peanut butter online through an online grocery store, and I got an email warning me that that peanut butter might be contaminated with salmonella. And the only reason that was possible is because the Consumer Product Safety Commission recall API exists, which is a data
Mm.
set that the online grocery provider, plugs into, and then automatically sent me the email about my peanut butter.
What was the peanut? I know people have very strong feelings about their peanut butter, so
Oh, it was
do you
Jif.
remember?
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, my
Like
kids
you
were
have
really
some
into
like
Jif at the time. Yeah.
arcane, got it, peanut
Yeah.
butter that you're.
Yeah, and
Um,
like, there's just so many ways that data touches our lives that that we are not aware of, that we take for granted. And if it disappears, like, we'll feel the impact, but we won't necessarily know, oh, that's because, that API disappeared.
right. On this point of data that impacts our lives and kind of some of our ways that we maybe don't understand it. I want to ask you if you have a favorite data set that you have worked with, that you come across, that is just like near and dear to your heart.
I do. My favorite data set right now is the North American Bat Monitoring database. It's a product out of USGS, and it takes in data about bat species and their locations from about 400 different sources around the country. And, you'd think like, "Oh, well, that seems like a weird, a frivolous data
Bat.
set for the federal
Yeah.
government." Yeah, bats. But it turns out that it's actually really important for our economy because, America's farmers receive billions of dollars of free services from bats every year when they eat
Hmm.
the harmful insects. And, and also, and if you wanna protect that free service, you have to protect the bats, and if you wanna protect the bats, you need to know where they are, and that's what this database does. And it also helps streamline permitting. So if you're installing a wind farm or expanding a mining operation or rehabbing an overpass, you have to fill out, sort of environmental impact statements, right? And instead of having to count the bats yourself, which probably would be very hard, you can just go to this database. It's like already there for you to use. So
Yeah.
it helps, it streamlines permitting so that we're not standing in the way of development. And then there's also crazy some research that shows that in rural communities where bat populations drop off precipitously, that infant mortality goes up because the
What? Yeah.
theory here is that the farmers have to use more pesticides because they're not getting that free service from the bats anymore, and it harms unborn babies.
Wow. Bats. I know
Bats,
I
bat data. I know.
yeah. I know I called you Spider-Man, but I feel like I should have called you, Batman instead,
Yeah.
just like you're all the superheroes, Denise. But yeah, I think, what I also is so fascinating to me about that is how much data touches our lives in ways that we don't always understand, right? Whether not
Right.
only like, the direct, like, oh, I'm now not going to get salmonella because, this, data set, exists, or I now like am able to get this tornado warning, but these, knock on effects that also, show up from these, types of data sets that we, probably many of, the folks on this call have never even heard of, but will, make a kind of significant, impact in their lives or even their, children's lives.
Mhm.
So very powerful and challenging for us to be in a time where we are losing, the staff, the funding, the reports, the, data on so many of these things. Um, I want to end with a question, which is, kind of where we always end for American inequality, which is on the path forward, right? It can feel really challenging and difficult for us to address so many of these issues, particularly folks who feel like they're maybe not technical, don't know who to call, don't know who collects, these different sources, didn't even know that many of these things exist and are now freaked out that all these things might be impacting their lives that they never even realized. Like,
Mhm.
whether it's from the, private sector or public sector or nonprofits or individuals, like, are there certain things that you have seen, to be effective for addressing, this negative change that we have seen? I think the, data index and some of the work that you are doing and joining those communities feels like a very, powerful and actionable way for a lot of people on this call, to address that. And I'll be sure to kind of follow up with, links on this as we send out the recording. But what else have you seen has been effective in this time?
There certainly is a protective effect, when the public informs the career staff on the inside about really important ways that data are being used, especially use cases that align with administration priorities. So as somebody who spent their career working on equity issues, that's probably not gonna be the most permeable use case right now. And so it's
Mm.
forcing me to think about like, okay, what businesses are using these data that I also depend on for equity assessments. So really broadening your aperture, and finding some unlikely colleagues who also depend on the data that's really important to you.
And you think that's kind of like the main angle then is less on this like, you know, this is the right thing, this is justice like to do with some of these data sets. It's more like what's the business angle or the private sector angle on some of this?
I think we need to get more creative about telling the story about how these data benefit everyday Americans and make it just really, very real. One thing that struck me during the big takedown of data at the end of last January was the reporting talking about how researchers were going to be harmed. right? It's like, well, yeah, they are, and so are the American people. And
Yeah.
so let's like shift it to, and and like let's just shift it to, the football coach who needs the heat index data so he knows when to move practice inside so his players don't get heat stroke. And that data is repackaged by commercial weather app providers. And so
Right, right.
often it's like it's invisible and we don't even realize that we're dependent on it. So making it visible and being just really explicit about how it touches everyday Americans. If you've got a data set that you really care about, like that's something that you can focus on. We do host workshops, which are really fun. They're about an hour long, where we'll break out into groups and we'll just workshop how to talk about a specific data set and a specific type of American who benefits from that data
Mm,
set, and work it up for our essential data
wow.
website.
Yeah, that's really powerful because I think, right, it's not just like the PhD who's not able to do their analysis or someone who like can't find their footnote anymore.
Right.
It's, really
Exactly.
impacting a lot of people and sometimes in ways that they might not even like this curious thing, right? They used to be able to check their weather app in a certain way and now they don't see something,
Right.
anymore. Or like a, marketing agency used to be able to like find more detailed geographic data or
Right.
target a certain subset and now they can't anymore. They don't see information, on those some certain
Yep.
groups. And so if you're an, entrepreneur who's trying to launch an app in some place and now are struggling to do so because you can't, determine how much internet access there is in a certain community, right? It can,
Right.
really make it, a real challenge for American ingenuity and innovation going forward too.
Right, exactly. So really broadening the aperture, so that as you're talking about the data sets you care about, you have a bunch of different examples in your back pocket that, depending on whether you're talking to a member of Congress or a federal data steward, you can give them. And what we have seen is that when federal data stewards are armed with that information, they, in some cases, can effectively advocate for the continued flow of those data. I think I attribute, like, the American Time Use Survey is still around, and I attribute some of that to the very robust public feedback that they got on how important that data set is.
Yeah. Well, Denise, this was so incredible. You are such an inspiration in so much of this work. I will be sure to share out, a lot of these different resources. But thank you so much for joining American Inequality today and for doing such great work to help so many communities.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy, for having me.
Of course. Talk soon.